like if we take Ahmed's case, Ahmed and his parents who I talked to were totally self-righteous about leaving Syria when they couldn't be safe there anymore and heading to Turkey and trying to travel the route. So what I mean is, they weren't ashamed that they were taking this journey. They didn't think that because it was illegal, they should be embarrassed.
Yeah.
That's the shamelessness, I mean. And there's, but it's not even just those individual stories. It's like an entire public climate of that. Like, they would talk freely, they'd talk to each other, they'd say hello to local people. There was no sense of like, we don't belong here. Until then there'd become repression and people, and the things would change. But in these periods when it was like robust and people were, and especially because people in the former Yugoslavia initially were really welcoming, there was like a total atmosphere of like, first the Balkan police were disorganized enough that they couldn't be very repressive even when they wanted to be. They didn't have the resources to be, but also people were pretty welcoming. And the only shame that was talked about was like shame on the Croatians for having pushed me back 18 times and stolen my cell phone and breaking it and beating me up and pushing me across, but not that I should be ashamed for crossing the border illegally. Does that help? Yeah, sorry, thank you. Please, please ask for clarifications. I wouldn't want to be misunderstood, but I don't quite know what to do with that or quite how to describe that, but it does seem to me that shamelessness, and it's a collective kind of mood of shamelessness. You'd go to a squatted place or an informal encampment, and you'd enter and people would be like happy to talk to you, they'd be welcoming, and they'd all gather around to tell you about their stories of illegal crossing with kind of excitement. And it seems like somehow that is like a social dimension of the autonomy of migration, of this border struggle realized, and of the attitude that it's something that they have a right to do, right?
I don't want to agree with, if I may.
Please.
I said because the really well aware of the situation was caused by the first war trees who involved in the situation in the town.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially like Afghans were especially aware of that, right? The coalition that of NATO forces that had occupied their country now for, we just had what, the 19th, 18th, 2002, so no, 17th. We just like a week ago, I think, had the anniversary, the 17th anniversary of the U.S.-led but NATO force invasion of Afghanistan, and I think there's really a moral economy that's different for different places, but for Afghans it was like, we're here because you went there. Like, Europeans have played an active role in destroying and destabilizing our country, and others from sub-Saharan Africa had a story that was about colonial relations and economic inequality and a claim to being able to go to where the wealth had been accumulated at their expense. But not every, those are the more political like interpretations I would hear. I would say among Afghans that was almost universal. That wasn't like a sort of intellectual or, that was like very ordinary, very poor people would articulate that. The anti-colonial critique, the more historical critique, I only heard from some more, I would say more educated people. But is that am I answering your question? Yeah. So I mean, there's a whole argument to be made that, that there are real, and I think people are making them along the route, that there is a form of justice of being able to access this area of global wealth that they feel very attached to in their lives and interwoven with, but separated from by bordering.
Yeah, sure.
I actually want to talk on the human rights side. Yeah. So after watching the short clip, it was kind of heartbreaking to know that we don't actually like understand their situation, and none of them actually choose to be in this situation. I mean, to be refugees, and it's kind of connecting to my last night lectures that there's a segment where people rights is actually limited to state. So what I mean is that so when these people is stateless or they're being like in refugees position, then their individual rights is gone. So what I wanna ask is just who's gonna actually protect these people, at least to claim back their own rights.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and we do have like a UN organization like UNHCR, but I don't know if that's effective to help. I mean, that makes sense.
Thank you. No, absolutely. Those are important questions. Very important. Yeah, and so as you're saying, in terms of international human rights are very weak and very poorly developed. And I think what Hannah Arendt said about rights really being derived from the state is still largely true if we're thinking in terms of the traditional way that we think about human rights. There's another way to think about human rights, which comes, some people trace to sort of Spinoza, but that is that we have human rights we have rights so far as we're able to collectively exercise them rather than we have them from the law. So there's one version that they are enshrined in law. Sometimes that's thought of as like granted by the states, other times that's thought of as negotiated between activists and the states, and then being enshrined in law as the formalization of relations of force between movements and representatives in the states. But there are even radical visions in which you have rights insofar as you're able to assert them. And that sort of brings me to this question of the right. People, both activists and some migrants, talked about a right to freedom of movement. I have ambivalent feelings about that because which version of rights are we talking about with that? And are we talking about a human right? Because that still seems to be discursively and legally a very weak grounds for rights in general in terms of the violations we see, and for a right that isn't even enshrined in law anywhere, the right to mobility, even more so. So, but I don't know. But I mean, but people feel that they have this right and this entitlement, and they're asserting and practicing it. I don't know what we make of that. That shamelessness I'm talking about is in part them feeling like, of course I have a right to eat, of course I have a right to keep my children safe, of course that's the obviousness with which they're traveling. Who's going to tell me I can't go and save my parents when they're in a war zone? What state is going to tell me that their authority to exclude or include whoever in their territory trumps my right to save my parents, right? I mean, so I think there's a moral economy and a sense of right that's separate from the law, that's in confrontation with the law if it's enshrined in state authority, right?
Over there, do you have questions?
There was a hand here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I would like to bring out a question regarding the bordering, the practice of bordering, and also refugee as well. Specifically, I will compare with ASEAN's situation, particularly with the Rohingya situations.
With Rohingya, is that? Yeah.
Because one thing that I don't really feel related to your presentation, not because of the knowledge inside, it's just that because at least in Malaysia, the inflow of refugees, although we deem are welcome, but never on the level that the media or the politician depict them as invasions.
Mm-hmm.
So in the sense that Malaysian government, at least although they do not sign the refugee conventions, but they still provide certain amount of humanitarian aid for the Rohingya and other refugees as well, because we also have refugees from the Afghanistan as well and other places, Syria as well. And but the thing is that although Malaysian government does not see these people as invasions, but the treatment of them can be said very, how to say, it's on the limbo of so-called legality, because since Malaysia does not sign the refugee convention, the Malaysian government does not recognize them as so-called migrant workers. So in legal terms, purely legal terms here, they are illegal migrants who are violated the sovereignty of Malaysia borders. But in this case, that it bring out further questions that bordering practice in ASEAN at least is a production of decades of or ages of colonizations. So which brings me to one. The first question is that in terms of Balkan Route, is there any historical context before the formation of the nation? Because it seems for me it's like we have some kind of historical residue in your presentation.
Thank you. Those are great questions.
Yeah. And second is that I want to also have a rebuttal that although Malaysia government does not see refugee as invasions, but refugee in Malaysia, specifically Rohingya, they can use this kind of opportunity, although they have not this kind of antagonist relationship necessary to Malaysia government, but they also have what one scholar, a Malaysian scholar in the US, his name is Fatima Miani. He done a lot of research on so-called migrant worker and refugee in Malaysia. He proposed the idea of so-called social encroachment, where this refugee does not necessarily to have so-called street protests to fight for their rights. They somehow can just encroach. I don't think this is a good word, but you get the idea. They try to gain their social and legal space specifically in KL. In KL, Kuala Lumpur, there's a city called Selayang, where most of the Rohingya people are gathered there. And although they've been constantly been raped by Malaysia police, but somehow they're still there, and they have some NGO, mostly Islamic NGO, helping them to set a foothold, at least in Malaysia, like establish free school for Rohingya kids, and establish NGO specifically helping them to become, at least in some sense, a form of society in Malaysia. There's a term in Islamic, it's called, if I'm not mistaken, Ummah, is it? A kind of solidarity.
The community, right?
Yeah, a kind of Muslim solidarity amongst the Muslims. Where it does not necessarily fit into the narrative for so-called human rights regime. It's another totally different things. So this is my second question. My third question is, before that you mentioned about Trump-Obama relationship. You didn't mention in your presentation, so I wonder.
Oh, I forgot to say that,
What's the relationship about?
Thank you, okay. And I think I've got them, but please push for more if I don't answer, because these are, I think these are some of the most interesting questions around this, and also what's interesting about putting struggle for mobility into relation across, regionally, across different experiences. And so it's very interesting, it's definitely, I would say that almost this idea of invasion is an extreme new articulation of the vilification of migrants, which previously had been really in the full-throated invasion enemy kind of framework was really relegated to the far margins of European political discourse, but over the last 3 or 4 years has come much more into the heart of European politics, and is fully dominant in Hungary. But but bordering practices aren't new in Europe, and the work that the border does has been pivotal to the constitution of the European labor market especially. And so I have some follow-up questions about how the soft illegal status of Rohingya in Malaysia affects them in terms of labor. Maybe you can say that, and then I can explain how it works to my mind in Europe. But does it have a labor effect? Is it,
No, because in Malaysia, refugee cannot work in Malaysia legally.
Right.
But because refugee, they also need to earn a living,
yeah,
so they need to be working
yeah,
illegally.
right.
So
exactly.
at the case I mentioned before, the Slovenian case, the
Yeah.
Rohingya people, somehow they establish a network, they can sell vegetable
Yeah.
in the market,
Yeah.
which I don't know why no people doing a research about how this kind of market, was it, the productions, the relationship of Malaysia and Rohingya, then establish that they at least sell something in Malaysia, because it's really interesting to see that Malaysia product agricultural productions can be sold by a refugee,
Yeah.
and no one seems interested in that.
So
And maybe before you move on, I would like to clarify maybe
Yeah.
one related question. Is it because of the Islam community so
Yes,
that they
maybe
take
part of the
Romania?
explanation.
Right. And also, are there underground business to take them over to and offer them some sort of a channel for this illegal work?
I don't think it need to be reduced to certain kind of shadow economy, but I think it's certainly that a kind of kinship is definitely will be established during the time when Rohingya refugees stay in Malaysia, because there are NGOs helping them, and even although Malaysia government doesn't recognize them as so-called refugee, but Malaysia government actually at some point try to incorporate the refugee worker as a working force in Malaysia.
yeah.
But without any solid explanation, the plan they say failed. I don't know why, because they never say clearly in the media, and also they never clearly publish anything on their so-called study. So this is the one of the reason that although refugee, I think certainly they can contribute into the workforce of Malaysia, but I don't know why Malaysia does not incorporate them in, at least legally speaking, or many of them are working so-called illegally. Some that maybe will apply for university student status, but they actually just want to have a place that they can have certain ground for them to work.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, this is for me what's really, one part of what's at stake in this shift from the wider and longer history of European border practices over the last 25 years, at least, if not longer. Well, let's take the 20 years of Schengen and the Eurozone, but the European Union has not tried to completely prevent migration or even undocumented migration, but it's definitely tried to manage or control the scale and size of that movement. It would be an economic disaster for a country like Germany or England, maybe England's bringing it on itself now, we'll see, to actually exclude migrants from the labor market. Things would grind to a halt. I mean, there's conspiracy theories about, why the route happened to Germany, because in part a huge German study, even by the Christian Democrats, had argued that 1.5 million new workers were desperately needed because the German economy was so strong before the Balkan Route happened. They got 1.6 million in the end. But leaving the route aside, the bordering practices produce a population of undocumented and illegalized workers. And like in the US, those workers come to do the cheap, some of the hardest agricultural labor, for example, in Greece and in Italy, right? And it's the production of workers who are at risk of being deported that renders them vulnerable for that kind of labor exploitation, right? Because deportation is always at hand, and because complaining to the authorities isn't a possibility, of course, right? I talked about the way that the presence of the route and this idea of movements upon movements, the ways that the route is, the presence of refugees has intersected with earlier histories of mobility in the region. But I sort of only mentioned some of the more recent examples, like with the Yugoslav, crossing the Yugoslav territory where they've been where many of the people in the country have themselves had experiences of being refugees. But there's a much longer history of mobility that's revealed by the presence of this route in all kinds of interesting and complicated ways. I just give one example in a little bit more detail, and it connects to the question of colonial legacies and the deeper history that's involved here. So I mentioned the Facebook directions as you cross it. You walk to the end of the train tracks in Macedonia, and when you see the border installation ahead, you head to the left towards the minaret, right? It turns out that village, Mirkovic, which is, people walked about the entire 1.2 million people that traveled this Balkan route, with the exception of maybe 25,000 people who crossed through Bulgaria, let's say, and didn't come through Greece, all crossed this single Albanian village, minority village in the south of Serbia, with a population of 2,500 people, 1,200 of whom are in Switzerland as guest workers. And it turns out that the imam of the mosque had studied through the Yugoslav non-aligned movement in Syria during the late 70s and early 80s. 7 years he'd done his theological training in Syria, and so it was part of the non-aligned movement, which was the alternative to the Soviet and U.S.-led power blocks. But it also has a much longer Ottoman history of people, the large Muslim population in the Balkans that's local to the Balkans, traveling to Syria for religious training. And he had learned Arabic there, had maintained close ties to people in Syria. And when activists started to flee Syrian repression, he basically set up an underground railroad where he was taking 5-10 people a day, were crossing those fields guided by the minaret, and he was putting them up in the mosque, and then using the empty apartments and homes of people in the village to house people before they then traveled onward, right? It's an amazing story. I could say more about. He eventually built a dirt road so that the refugees crossing wouldn't have to walk in the mud anymore across those fields, and got permission from the 7 landowners that you have to cross those fields. But what that points, the larger issue that points to is the presence of, I don't know, I guess 8 million, European Muslims who live in the Balkans, and another probably 5 or 6 million who were driven out of Europe in waves of ethnic cleansing aimed at Europeans in the formation of European nation states. Greek uprising against the Ottoman Empire, the Serbian one, then when the Austro-Hungarian Empire took control of Bosnia in 1876, many of the most religious, scared of being under Austrian rule, fled. But then even the wars that Serbia waged against both Muslims in Bosnia and in Kosovo led to a huge new diasporas of Muslims being driven out of Europe through the violence of European state formation. And what it's doing is raising the ethnic complexity that is the legacy of the Ottoman Empire in the region, where demographic politics were very different and not modeled on a nation state model, right? And so in many ways what you can see so this is the this is the former Yugoslavia, right, is this territory, which is incredibly diverse. And in the process of forming Serbia as a separate nation state, Bosnia and Croatia, etc., you have the violent imposition of the model of that national sovereignty that I was talking before on a territory that, much like other post-colonial states, has a radically diverse local population that doesn't fit in the nation-state container, right? Which is as true of Africa as it is in Asia as well, and it's true for the Balkans because of those legacies. And so what's really interesting is you see, in many ways, I think you can see the nation-state project, and this is what Foucault has argued, that it's an internal colonization. It's taking the violence of the colonial project, technologies developed in the colonies, and imposing it on internal then populations and the regulation of society back in Europe. And we see the sort of that process happening in the Balkans. And what's interesting is much of the resistance much of the assistance by local activist groups in the Balkans for refugees passing through came directly out of traditions of resisting that violent nation-state formation of one kind or another. And so there's incredible ties between those Ottoman legacies and the politics they produced of pluralism as in opposition to the nationalist politics that is being violently imposed that we see in the Hungarian solution as well, which is of course aimed just as much at internal enemies in Hungary like the Jews and the Roma as it is at internal enemies like people on the move, right? This idea of encroachment, yeah, I mean, this is the problem. Like, there's a real struggle to carve out space that people have to make when they're formally undocumented in the way they are in Malaysia, right? But you want to be careful with the terminology because you don't want to play into to encourage the threat kind of frame. And encroachment sounds so much like an external threat, right? Yeah. But on the other hand, you want to do justice to it being something that's a fight, a struggle for a space and for an existence. So it's a balancing act, right? If you only portray people as victims, then you deny that contestation over their presence that they're very much involved with, not always in protest. I mean, I think actually the foundation for protest, I would say, I bet there's something similar. I mean, I bet there's a whole, network of survival practices that are the common resources that are here in Malaysia, I suspect, just like there are for common practices for mobility across the Balkans, and that at some point that form of social organization could become politicized, right? There's more I could say on the Ummah and how that's played, this idea of a Muslim community. It was interesting, I don't know, should I say more about that now or should I wait? I feel like I've been talking for so long without a question. But these are such interesting questions.
I guess,
So I was really interested in what role this idea of a broader community that isn't a nation state one, especially this distinctly Muslim one, might have when as soon as the route turned through Bosnia. Because what happened was people, like I told you about the person who took the photos who had crossed 18 times unsuccessfully until his 19th time he finally managed, right? He was in Serbia. He would cross across the sort of green fields here and try to, without being seen in an entirely white country as a very visible Afghan, cross the entire country, get across Slovenia and get, touch screen, I didn't know that. Sorry. Okay. I went forward one by doing that. Okay, so when he saw he couldn't, so when people finally realized that there was so much repression, you couldn't get across, it's like 350 kilometers you have to cross without being seen somehow, right? Which is just preposterous.
So people started to move into Bosnia, which is really it's a European protectorate. It's, you know, it's as close as you have to a colonial relationship in Europe today, where the executive can suspend, the European appointed executive can suspend any legal decision by the elected authorities. But anyway, it's a really non-functioning state precisely because of the disarray of trying to impose a nationalist model on a country, the most diverse of all the Yugoslav republics, where you have